Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Wendy Wolford. I'm Cornell's Vice Provost for International Affairs and a faculty member in the Department of Global Development. The meeting today, this space is an opportunity for all of us to learn more about what's happening in Ukraine, what's going on with the war right now. We're going to be hearing from and having a discussion with people who have both expertise and experience in the region. And we have a few key questions that we will pose to them. So I'm going to quickly turn it over to Bryn Rosenfeld, who is Assistant Professor of Government at Cornell and our moderator today. But first, just a few quick organizational points. The first one is that the schedule is in the chat. The second one is that we're organizing this, as you can see, as a Zoom meeting with everybody present on the screen, which is a bit unusual. So we'd like to ask that you please use the chat sparingly and only post questions that you would like the speakers to address. We'll pull questions from the chat and Bryn will pose those to the speakers during the Q&A. We'll also be using the chat to communicate with you and providing speaker titles and other resources. So we'll keep most people muted until the breakout rooms. Also, a quick reminder that this event today will be followed by a student organized teach-in next Friday, so March 25th, and more details will come from then. As I turn the mic over to Bryn, I'll just say that we've organized this first part of today's events as a news show. So Bryn will be interviewing the contributors, and we hope that this allows them to get their key points across while also leaving ample time for question and answer or discussion. So thank you very much for joining us, and thank you, Bryn, for moderating.
Thanks very much, Wendy. As Wendy said, I'm Bryn Rosenfeld, Assistant Professor of Government. I want to thank you all so much for taking the time to be part of this really important conversation. I want to begin just by setting the scene, and then I'll turn it over very quickly to the Ukrainian scholars who've agreed to be part of today's panel. So overnight on February 23rd, it happens, this is the day that Russia celebrates the patriotic holiday of Fatherland Defenders Day. So clearly time to capitalize on that sentiment. Russia began a massive invasion of Ukraine. Today marks 3 weeks since the start of that invasion, and a moment at which, for many lives around the world, things cardinally shifted. I should note that Russian President Vladimir Putin calls this a special military operation, and has in fact since the start of the war imposed prison terms of up to 15 years for those using the term invasion, war, or attack to describe Russia's actions in Ukraine. But that is exactly what they are. They were a full-scale attack from the north, from the south, and from the east of Ukraine, involving an estimated 190,000 Russian troops that Russia had massed along the Ukrainian border under the pretext of conducting military exercises for months. So we have the privilege today of being joined by 3 scholars who are based in Ukraine. It's nighttime in Ukraine now, and across the country, Russia is bombarding Ukrainian cities nightly. So in such a tenuous wartime context, I want to express again our very deep gratitude to them for sharing their on-the-ground perspective. It has been the case at many points, whether it was the quote-unquote negotiations leading up to Russia's invasion, or since that, the conversation seems to take place between actors in the US and the EU and Russia, and marginalizes Ukrainian voices. And I think it's so important here today that we'll hear from experts and students across our own Cornell community, but also have the chance to hear from faculty members teaching their own students and engaged in their own research in Ukraine. So I'm going to turn the floor over to them in just a moment. I want to let you know that you'll have the opportunity, as you think of questions for our speakers, to type them into the chat box. We'll select some of your questions to ask the speakers during the Q&A period, which we'll hold after they've all had a chance to share their most pressing thoughts about the war with us. So I'm going to start by first asking two professors joining us from Ukraine, what should people know about the war and what can people outside Ukraine and at Cornell do to help? So let me first introduce Natalia Kudratseva, is a professor of translation and Slavic studies at Kryvyi Rih State University, who's now living in the southern Ukrainian city of Kherson. Kherson is a port city on the Black Sea. It was one of the first cities that Russia claimed to occupy. Russia has had Kherson under siege and has tried amidst really dramatic civil resistance by ordinary Ukrainians to occupy the city since about a week into the war. So Natalia, let me turn it over to you now and ask you what is happening there and what do you think is most pressing for us to know about the war? Thanks.
Well, thank you, dear colleagues, for inviting me and for giving me this opportunity to speak about what has been going on here in Ukraine. Yes, you're quite right, Bryn. Thank you for this presentation. I've been living in Kherson and I've been staying here for the whole time of its occupation since the 1st of March. I think that people around the world should realize that it is not a local war. It's easy to be deceived by the long propagandized messages portraying Ukraine as a divided country with cleavages drawn either between the East and West or between Ukrainian speakers and Russian speakers. This was the story made up by Russian propaganda to justify the annexation of Crimea and the military aggression in Donbass in 2014. And the point then was to portray this first Russian invasion as a civil war in Ukraine. I know that some Western experts reiterated this propagandistic message, and I can see why this explanation worked for them. Because it's really easy and it's very comfortable to give such explanations, which remain explanations only, and do not demand any further action on the part of those who explain. By framing the whole thing as a civil war, it was very easy and comfortable to stay aside. But the case is that it was not a civil war. The case is that it was not about the imaginary divisions between Ukrainian speakers and Russian speakers. As a social linguist focusing on the issues of language choice and identity building in the southeastern parts of Ukraine, I've been documenting a building trajectory for the inclusive civic national identity, which can be accompanied by the shift to Ukrainian from Russian, or can be constructed independently of the language choice. Language is not and was never an issue here. And Russia's war in Ukraine is not a local war. It is not just a war on Ukraine. It's a war on almost the whole of the rest of the world. And primarily, it's a war on the West. If you might want to listen a little bit more attentively to Russians, you would hear that they attribute the whole blame to the West. The West is pumping weapons into Ukraine. The West is oppressing Russia with sanctions are their main messages. What people should know about what is happening in Ukraine is that this is happening not just in Ukraine. The confrontation is for the most part not between Ukraine and Russia, but between Russia and the whole civilized world. People in other countries, including the United States, should not be looking for these easy explanations which would allow them to stay aside. People should realize that what is happening in one part of the world will inevitably affect the other parts too. It's easy to think in terms of distances, as it was in the case with the United States in the Second World War. In fact, America is situated quite far from Europe, but Pearl Harbor unfortunately turned out to be not so far. What people should do now is that they should do everything to stop this war in Ukraine. Help us to stop the war here until it reaches somebody else. Don't take easy explanations. Don't stay aside. Don't be silent. Protest the war. Contact your congressman and ask them to take action to stop the war in Ukraine. Ask them for a non-fly zone over Ukraine's nuclear power plants at least. I can understand that they may be afraid of a Russian nuclear strike, but what if Russians blow up one of our nuclear power plants instead? So please, resist easy explanations. Kherson has been occupied by Russian troops since the 1st of March, and since then there hasn't been a single day without public protest. There hasn't been a single day without us making them hear that we will resist. Russians have been firing and throwing grenades at the protesting people, but we keep on protesting, either in Ukrainian or in Russian. We are resisting. So you too should make Russia hear that you will resist this war. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Natalia. Next, I want to turn it over to Yulia Bidzemka, an associate professor of political science at Harkev University in northeastern Ukraine. Harkev is Ukraine's second largest city. Russian troops today continue their movements to encircle Harkev. While for weeks already, the city has been the target of Russian, aerial and land-based bombing campaigns. You can tell us, Yulia, about Ukrainian resistance and the role of civil society and volunteer networks. What can you tell us about the role of activists on the ground during the war? Thanks.
Many thanks for such introduction. Really, I would say that civil society and local elites always were in the focus of my research. That is why I also now included as a practitioner in the building of these chains of supplies of humanitarian aid, and actually I try to connect people from the different spheres, because the civil society in Ukraine expanded during last 3 weeks. I would say that before the war, about 8% of Ukrainians declared themselves to be very active in civil life. But mostly a lot of people, especially in eastern part of Ukraine, declare themselves being out of politics. And actually in Kharkiv, a lot of people, I would say that about 60% of people had civic identity, but also the large number of Kharkiv inhabitants used Russian in their everyday lives. And actually this data was very painful for Russia, because they counted to occupy Kharkiv and the eastern part of Ukraine very fast. And even in their propaganda messages, they said that people here in Kharkiv would gladly meet them bringing flowers to Russian soldiers. But they were hardly mistaken. And actually, being interviewed a lot before the war by foreign media, I underlined the fact that actually lingual belonging is not about the self-identity as a Russian or Ukrainian. Actually, I can explain even why Harkev and Mariupol were so targeted by Russian army. Maybe the existence of such cities, large cities, which are Russian-speaking mostly, but with a strong Ukrainian civic identity, it destroys whole the concept of the Russian world. Because Russia grounded their propaganda based on Russian culture and Russian language, and maybe in sharing the Orthodox Christianity. But actually we can see that main cleavages between Russians and Ukrainians apparently in their values, not in their ethnicity or lingual belonging or usage the language in their everyday lives. So I also want to underline that now Ukrainian civil society is not so distinguished with the mass society, because new actors came to these volunteers networks. I know a lot of businessmen who were out of any civic activities. They just made their businesses but now they included in these civil networks. Actually, local elites are also very close to this resistance, and I would say that it is kind of a sign that decentralization reform, so broadly supported by international community and foreign donors, really works, because a lot of people in their communities, a lot of deputies of local councils, they really feel themselves responsible for their communities and for their resistance. And actually, I would also like to add that being a political scientist, I also can um, say that Russian messages about that Ukraine is a failed state also is destroyed by Ukrainian resistance at the moment, and by the efficiency of national and local institutions. They are working all together. There are no bureaucracy at the moment, and I would say that if you apply with some kind of issues to business community, to volunteers, to civil society organization, or to local authorities, you will get this assistance very quick and fast. And I do remember the message of Professor Dr. Fukuyama, who said that the radius of trust, of mutual trust, is very important for the democratic development of European, or let's say broadly Western countries. And I would say that this radius of mutual trust is expanded in Ukraine. So a lot of institutions, local or national ones, they are really trusted at the moment by Ukrainians, and this mutual trust between people who never met each other before, it's really how it works in Ukraine at the moment. And maybe my last sentence I will address to the differences between Russia and Ukraine in their perception of the information. And I would say that free media in Ukraine was really a great achievement of Ukrainian development, because we can see that Russian army tried to target televisions and try to capture TV channels when they occupy the city or they shell in the city. But actually digitalization in Ukraine really works, and people trusted to very independent and different sources. That is why I would say that even people in occupied territories, or even people under the shellings in their bomb shelters, they can get information, and they perceive this information very critically. That is why Russian propaganda is not working in Ukraine, and civil activists, even in Kherson, Melitopol, Berdyansk, they are staying in their resistance, and they protest every day against Russian regime and against Russian propaganda, because they just don't buy it.
Thank you, Yulia. Yulia, remind me, have you left Harkev, or you've left since the start of the war? I wanted to kind of underscore this, of how many Ukrainians have been forced to move, either displaced internally, or of course, as we'll get to other dimensions of the conflict, become refugees abroad, but continuing, like Yulia, their work. Yeah,
actually I left Kharkiv and it was impossible to stay there for me, because my apartment has no heating, and there are very low temperature at the moment, and I have no internet in my home, and my workplace totally destroyed by Russian airstrikes. So Karazin University is really suffered maybe the most among other universities, and I would say that about 2/3 of Kharkiv inhabitants they left the city, but we have no I would say the whole picture, because there are evacuation trains in Harkev, and about 20,000 of people live in Harkev every day, daily, and we cannot count those people who left Harkev by cars. but I witnessed the thousands of cars just driving to the western border or to the western regions of Ukraine. So approximately it could be up to 600 of thousands of people or even more.
Thanks, Julia. And of course, the mention of the damage that Kazan State University has sustained reminds us that the bombardment of cities like Harkev have affected lots of civilian infrastructure as well. All right, so I want to thank you all very, very much for sharing your views. I know it's late at night there, so we'll wish you well and to stay safe and to keep in touch. I want to turn now to a few Cornell faculty members to discuss different facets of the war. Okay, so I thought we'd begin with how Russia is waging this war. In the first days of the war, the indications were that Russia was trying to make very quick inroads to Kyiv, that they were Russian military was attempting to bypass cities, that the Russian military was not, say, employing force in the way that it often has in previous military campaigns, that it was underutilizing airstrikes this strategy encountered very stiff resistance from Ukrainian forces. As you may have read, Russia's problems with logistics, mounted very quickly over coming days, and just generally Russia's strategic blunder in thinking that it could get to Kyiv in a kind of thunder run in 3-4 days became very clear. So that by the start of the second week, there was a kind of growing expectation that Russia would change tactics and that the war would become much bloodier with the targeting of civilians and civilian infrastructure. And so I want to turn now to Professor Matt Evangelista, Professor of Government. What kind of tactics is Russia using now? And can you tell us how Russian military practices in prior campaigns in Chechnya or in Syria provide kind of prelude or preview of the current situation in Ukraine?
Yes, thank you, Bryn. I'd like to start, though, by expressing my sympathy and solidarity with our Ukrainian colleagues and friends, and also those Russians who have been resisting and protesting against this brutal invasion. If we look at the military campaign in Ukraine, we basically see the culmination of Russian practices going back to the mid-1990s, even before Vladimir Putin became the Russian leader. There were 2 bloody wars conducted against Chechnya, ostensibly to keep that breakaway region in the Russian Federation. But the first one entailed massive bombing of the capital city, Grozny, where mostly ethnic Russians were living because they couldn't flee to the countryside the way the Chechens who lived there could. Vladimir Putin, when he was appointed by Boris Yeltsin, who started the first war, resumed the war, and it became a source of support for him. It helped him win an election in March 2000. That war was even worse. Massive bombing of cities, Grozny again. People compared it to Stalingrad during World War II, Gudermes, campaigns of creating so-called filtration camps, kidnappings, torture, extrajudicial killings, massive human rights abuses that the European Court on Human Rights has acknowledged and accused Russia of carrying out. When Russia intervened in Ukraine in 2014 and seized Crimea, it was quite a violent campaign as well, but without the kind of attacks on cities that we saw. Yet a year later, in 2015, the Russian armed forces were invited by the dictator of Syria, Bashar al-Assad, to join that war. And then we saw the same kinds of approaches, deliberate targeting of civilian apartments, hospitals, as we saw just in Mariupol, but it became so much part of the Russian campaign that I argue that Russia wages warfare by war crime. So deliberate targeting of civilians. And even in the first couple of days of the attack against Ukraine, when there were negotiations on creating humanitarian corridors, my reaction was, oh no, there are going to be more atrocities, because that's deliberately what the Russians did in Chechnya, in Syria, and now in Ukraine. They negotiate a humanitarian corridor, and as people are fleeing the city, they bomb them. So this has become the Russian approach. And as you say, Bryn, when the forces got bogged down, they increased this escalation. And I'm afraid that we're going to see much more of it. I admire the Ukrainian resistance, but I don't doubt that Putin will continue to escalate and deliberately target civilians.
Thanks, Matt. Let me ask a follow-up. As Russia's bombardment of Ukrainian cities has increased, become much more bloody and very, very tragic. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, joined with many others, has called for NATO to establish a no-fly zone over Ukraine. Can you help us understand how a no-fly zone would work and what its risks might be?
Ure. I mean, it's understandable that there would be pleas for a no-fly zone when Ukrainian civilians are being killed by bombs. The problem is that, and the reason why the United States has resisted enacting a no-fly zone is twofold. From a practical standpoint, most of the attacks are coming from the ground. They're coming from artillery and missiles, which those attacks could not be prevented by carrying out a no-fly zone, implementing a no-fly zone. The other issue is the problem of escalation. What does it really mean to carry out a no-fly zone? If we look at the historical examples of no-fly zones that the United States have implemented, they have been against much weaker countries. For example, after the defeat of Saddam Hussein's Iraq in the 1991 war, Saddam Hussein began attacking Kurdish and Shia areas, and the United States implemented a no-fly zone there. It was able to implement a no-fly zone against Serbia when it intervened in support of Kosovo. The way that the United States Air Force, which would be the main service required to carry out a no-fly zone, the way that it thinks about it is basically it has to destroy in advance any assets that would lead to the prevention of a no-fly zone. So the first targets that the Air Force attacks are the air bases from which planes could interrupt the no-fly zone, anti-air defense, missiles and artillery, radar that could direct those anti-air defenses. And where are those targets? They are mostly in Russia. In fact, when Russia attacked the facility near Lviv, near the Polish border, they did it from an airplane that stayed in Russian airspace. So from a practical matter, a no-fly zone would not deal with the main threats to people, and it would clearly entail a war with Russia. Now, I have colleagues, I have Ukrainian colleagues, I have American colleagues who say, well, it's only a matter of time, so why not engage Russia now? And I think that is an understandable reaction, but it really depends on an assumption that Putin would back down and that we wouldn't get a world war and possibly a nuclear war out of that kind of confrontation. So it's frustrating because we all feel awful about what's happening to people there, but the no-fly zone is unfortunately not a magic solution to that terrible situation.
So without a no-fly zone, the humanitarian consequences of Russia's bombardment of Ukrainian cities are very profound. I want to turn now to the question of refugees since the start of the conflict. Over 3 million people have fled fighting in Ukraine. Something like 2 million of them today are in Poland, a country that has received Ukrainian refugees since the start of the separatist conflict, the one in eastern Ukraine that began some 8 years ago. There are conversations about Poland becoming for the foreseeable future a bilingual society. And of course, the resettlement of Ukrainian refugees in countries all along the Ukrainian border and Hungary, Romania, Moldova, and other countries. So I want to turn now to Stephen Yalor, professor of immigration law practice at the law school. Steve, would you tell us about the refugee crisis that's been created by Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and also what Cornell as an institution, its faculty and students, can and are doing? Thanks.
Great. Well, this is clearly one of the biggest humanitarian crises in recent memory. In addition to the 3 million or so that have left Ukraine, as Yulia mentioned, there are 1 million more that are internally displaced in Ukraine. There are negotiations, as Matt pointed out, about establishing a humanitarian corridor to allow others to leave. We don't know whether they'll be able to leave safely, but if they were, the United Nations estimates that another 4 million people would leave Ukraine shortly. So this is a huge crisis. The Europeans are bearing the brunt of this. The European Union is trying to help individual countries like Poland by creating something that they call the Temporary Protection Directive to allow people fleeing Ukraine to be able to stay in the European Union for up to 3 years with work permits. And that is a great idea, but it's going to be a lot of work for the European Union to try to work with individual asylum agencies to register people, to get them work, to find them housing, et cetera. This is the first time that the European Union has tried to do something on this kind of scale. But we should not forget that there are other refugee hotspots around the world. Overall, there are 84 million individuals who have been forcibly displaced. It's the highest level in record. For example, there are 13.5 million displaced Syrians, representing more than half of Syria's population. A lot of them tried to flee to Europe, and they did not receive the same kind of welcome reception in Europe that the Ukrainians are now. So with that crisis, with the Afghanistan refugee crisis, our whole international refugee system is reeling from all of these crises. Cornell is doing a lot to the extent that it can. It supported, before the government came out with temporary protected status for Ukrainians, an effort. By that effort, they signed a letter with many other colleges, and in part because of that pressure, the government has now allowed Ukrainians who are already in the United States to get an equivalent to what the Europeans have offered, to allow Ukrainians to stay here for up to 18 months. So that benefits those 30,000 or so Ukrainians who are already in the United States, but it doesn't help other people try to get to the United States. We don't have a special visa that allows people to come to the United States because of the crisis in Ukraine. They have to go to an embassy or consulate outside of Ukraine, like in Poland or Germany, and apply for one of our regular visas, a tourist visa. But many times those are going to be denied because they aren't really tourists. They're really trying to flee Ukraine. We do have an international refugee system in the United States, but overall, worldwide, we only expect to admit about 125,000 of those refugees, and that's worldwide, not accounting for what's going on in Ukraine. So a lot of people will not be able to enter that way. What Cornell students can do is put more pressure on Congress. Like Natalia pointed out, we need to put more pressure on Congress and the Biden administration to step up aid to Ukraine and to strengthen our international refugee organizations so that they can help these people wherever they are. Similarly, next fiscal year, we should admit many, many more refugees to the United States. It's not a short-term solution, but it can help people in the long term if we admit more refugees to the United States. But as Natalia pointed out, this war affects all of us, and this humanitarian crisis shows how interconnected we all are. And I hope that this will help us reinvigorate our international refugee system.
Thanks, Steve. I think from here, I'd like to turn now to Steve Israel, former US Congressman, now the director of Cornell's Institute for Politics and Global Affairs, a professor of the practice in the government department. Steve, could you tell us about the US congressional response to the conflict?
I can, Bryn, thank you. And thanks to the Cornell community for doing this. My view is informed by my time serving on the House Armed Services Committee and the Appropriations Defense Subcommittee, and conversations I had with my former colleagues in Washington yesterday. Just the three top lines, I suppose. First, in a poisonous and polarized environment, the congressional response to Ukraine has been entirely bipartisan, more bipartisan than on almost anything that I have seen. And so President Zelensky has been the great unifier on Capitol Hill in the United States Congress. Congress passed on March 2nd a resolution stating it's, and I'm reading from the resolution, stating that it stands steadfastly, staunchly, proudly, and fervently behind the Ukrainian people in their fight against the authoritarian Putin regime. Three members of Congress voted against that, three Republicans, Paul Gosar from Arizona, Mr. Massey from Kentucky, and Congressman Rosenfeld from Montana. And then a week later, on March 10th, as many of you know, the House passed an emergency supplemental appropriations bill, $4 billion for humanitarian assistance for Ukraine, $3 billion in military defensive assistance, and about $2 billion for cybersecurity and energy assistance. Yesterday, the White House announced an additional $800 million in security assistance to Ukraine. That brings the total investment from the White House with respect to Ukraine to $2 billion since the start of the Biden administration. I'll just give you a sense of what that covers. $800 million includes 800 Stinger anti-aircraft systems, 2,000 Javelin, 1,000 light anti-armor weapons, 6,000 AT-4 anti-armor systems, 100 tactical unmanned aerial systems, 100 grenade launchers, 5,000 rifles, 1,000 pistols, 400 machine guns, 400 shotguns, 20 million rounds of small arms ammunition and grenade launcher and mortar rounds, 25,000 sets of body armor, 25,000 helmets. That was just announced yesterday by President Biden. I'm reading directly from the president's statement. And so we have seen an absolutely bipartisan bicameral response on both sides of Pennsylvania Avenue. I'll wrap up by presenting a flashing yellow light on where we are and where Congress and the administration may go. Here's what people should watch. The reason this is so deeply bipartisan now is because it's easy to be bipartisan about it. Remember that for the next several months, forgive me, but to talk just from a purely political perspective against the backdrop of this immense human tragedy, politically, everything over the next few months in Washington, D.C. will go through one filter, and that is the midterm elections. And we know that gas prices will be a very important part of the narrative of midterm elections. And so additional sanctions and sustaining sanctions on Russian gas and oil, to the extent that it continues to elevate gas prices, you may see a change in the bipartisan nature on Capitol Hill with respect to sanctions. And I can tell you, I learned yesterday that Democrats are fashioning a bill right now to suspend the federal federal gas tax in order to bring down prices. The problem with that is you can suspend the federal gas tax, but that doesn't obligate oil companies to actually reduce the price of gas by a commensurate level. And you will continue to see strong bipartisan reluctance to any kind of kinetic environment in Ukraine. Every member of Congress is sympathetic to what they hear back home. People are all for promoting Ukraine's security and protecting the Ukrainian people, but to the extent that there are boots on the ground, there is no strong support for that, and therefore most members of Congress will not go that far. And finally, what I do think you will see over the next few weeks is an increase in congressional chatter about war crimes tribunals against Putin and other Russian officials. An ICC referral will not work. It won't work because Russia would have to approve of that in the UN Security Council for a referral to the ICC. But there is talk about a special international tribunal on aggression, and that has become increasingly bipartisan. And I think that you'll see more focus and attention on Putin and that avenue over the next several weeks.
Steve, you know, your remarks about the bringing together for this in a bipartisan nature, Democrats and Republicans on Ukraine, reminds me of another, in the weeks leading up to the war, a lot of analysts said Putin will never go for the full-scale invasion because nothing would bring Europe and the United States closer together. Nothing would unite the EU quite like this. So we've got very significant bipartisanship right now. I edited the Washington Post Monkey Cage. We ran a piece recently that said this isn't likely to last. You've echoed that in your own remarks. Practically speaking, right, as supporters of our own political parties, how can we push our representatives to maintain constructive bipartisanship so that we're able to do the best as a country for Ukraine?
Yeah, let me just comment on one thing you said, and then we can talk specifically and pragmatically on how to maintain this level of bipartisanship. I think that Putin blundered calamitously. I think part of his calculation was that the United States was weak and divided, and that this was an opportunity for him to move on Ukraine, and the United States would be incapable of galvanizing and marshaling external support against him and even internal opposition to him. And he failed calamitously on that. I mean, this country is as divided is as united and determined on this as I've ever seen, both in polling and in congressional sentiment and bipartisan agreement between Congress and the White House. But I do fear, as you rightly point out, that this will erode. I remember standing on the steps of the Capitol the night of 9/11, holding hands with my colleagues, singing "God Bless America," and believing that bipartisanship would last, for as long as a decade, and it began to evaporate very, very quickly. And that is why it's so vitally important for the Cornell community to be communicating with members of Congress and the leadership and the Biden administration on two fronts. Number one, making sure that they continue to cooperate on the defensive equipment, the technologies, the funding that is necessary. More appropriations are likely to be necessary, more appropriations for humanitarian aid. And number two, to the point that was raised before, we're going to need to focus on bipartisan cooperation with respect to refugee assistance. I would say that really does need to be a focus. In 1939, I'm a student of the Wagner Rogers Act. Most people don't know about that, but in 1938, a Republican congresswoman from Boston and a Democratic senator from Tammany Hall Democrat, Senator Wagner, introduced a bill to lift quotas on children refugees coming from Nazi Germany. Everybody believed it would pass. It didn't pass. Congress does not usually demonstrate the strength and the principle that it must to ensure that we are accepting refugees, and that's going to need to be a very strong focus. Cornell community should really be communicating with members of Congress to begin the process of developing legislation that will welcome those refugees on our shores.
Thanks, Steve. That's great. I want to turn now to Christina Florea, Assistant Professor of History. Christina, let's talk next about Ukraine's history and national identity. And I expect you'll probably pick up on some of the very important points that Natalia and Yulia made here at the outset. And we've all heard by now Putin's claims that Ukrainians and Russians are one people. What can you tell us about the historical context for Ukrainian national identity in these claims, and the impact that the war will likely have on it.
Right. Thank you so much, Bryn, for this question. And thank you, everybody, for putting together this event. I guess I'd just like to start by saying that I think this war, when it comes to the story of Ukrainian national identity, is really a story of unintended or unforeseen consequences. And namely, what I mean by that is that by launching this war of aggression against Ukraine, Putin has basically set into motion a process of deepening rifts between two nationalities, now envisioned increasingly in ethno-national, along ethno-national lines, whose histories have actually been deeply intertwined. So in other words, I guess what I'm trying to say is that Putin's war is creating, I think, a new type of Ukrainian national identity that arguably was not the same before. And that is increasingly probably defined by hostility to Russia. The other thing I'd like to add, right, from a historical perspective, what's really interesting is that Russia wasn't really by definition always enemy number one for Ukrainians. As my Ukrainian colleagues have pointed out, Ukraine has been truly bilingual until very recently, with Russian and Ukrainian being used interchangeably. And here, I'd just like to mention when I myself was doing archival research there in a small town in southwestern Ukraine, I was present when the Euromaidan event started in 2014, and I was talking to people around me who had collected in this square and were protesting. And because I wasn't fluent in Ukrainian at the time, I addressed them in Russian and then apologized for it. And they both turned to me and said, "Oh, don't you worry about it, because Ukraine has this longer European history. We are tolerant of other languages and we really don't mind. You can speak whatever you like." So after 2014, I think things began changing. And just as a reminder of what happened then, it's the Ukrainian President Yanukovych basically promised to come to an agreement with the EU, but then bailed out at the last minute, essentially pressed into making that decision and bribed by Vladimir Putin. And that launched then the revolution that was then known as Euromaidan, or later also as the Revolution of Dignity, which, as we know, then resulted in the occupation of Crimea and war on the eastern provinces of Donetsk and Luhansk. But even after 2014, Ukrainians continued maintaining ties with Russia. And as we might know, also President Zelensky, who was elected right recently, moved on a platform of reconciliation with Russia. So, he himself is a native Russian speaker. So all of this is to say basically that the conflict we're witnessing now, one is, it might come as a surprise to people who have not been following what's happening in the region, but it is a continuation of something that began in 2014 and wasn't really resolved. And two, it's a much bolder move on Putin's part, right, who's now not only, contesting where these territories in the east should be, but effectively denying that such a thing as a Ukrainian nation exists, or that it's for him one and the same as a Russian nation. But the supreme irony, I think, is that in doing so, Putin is creating completely new rifts between Russians and Ukrainians that weren't really there before. Encouraging or pushing a narrow ethno-national vision of national identity that, as you and Natalia also mentioned, were really not the dominant mode before in Ukraine. And just from a broader perspective, I think I'd like to conclude by saying that all of this actually does not surprise me, because many nationalisms in Eastern Europe over the course of the 19th and 20th centuries altered dramatically as a result of wars, or were actually born out of war. And I think this is another instance of that process. And in fact, that happened to Ukrainians before in World War I and World War II. I think this is another maybe pivotal moment in this evolution.
Thanks very much, Christina. So I finally want to pivot again here to talk about some of the economic consequences of the war on Ukraine. So Putin effectively ended Russia's business ties to the West overnight, 30 years of global integration. As the US and the EU united to impose these very significant sanctions. But since the start of the war, some have also argued that Russia doesn't have a weak hand in all this, that the effective deintegration of Russia from the global economy will itself have a big impact on the US and other Western economies, if not immediately, in the medium to longer term. So I want to turn now to Ishwar Prasad, Professor of Applied Economics and Management, with the question of how this conflict will affect the global economy.
Thanks, Bryn. It's remarkable the alacrity and unity with which the US and other Western economies have pulled together a very potent combination of technological, financial, and trade sanctions. So the question is, what effect is this happening? On the Russian economy, the effect is very clear. This is an economy that was trying to get very integrated into global trade and finance, that relies on exports for a large share of its revenues. So it is enormously damaging the Russian economy, I think, for a long time to come. Is it affecting the rest of the world? Now, if you think about it in pure mechanical terms, Russia doesn't matter that much to the world economy. It amounts to about 2% of global GDP. So even if the Russian economy were to collapse, it would not have a direct effect on global growth. But Russia does matter in other ways. Russia is, of course, an important exporter of energy products, and Russia and Ukraine put together do amount to significant exporters of wheat products. Now, the world economy is quite integrated when it comes to markets such as oil. So we can talk about banning Russian oil. We can talk about trying to limit imports from Russia, but that is going to have an effect in particular on food prices and on energy prices, which at a time of rising inflation in the US and other Western economies certainly is going to take a bit of a toll. So even though the direct impact is not very substantial, there is going to be a significant marginal impact in terms of certain commodities and products. But then there is the broader issue that the world economy is at a rather complicated juncture right now. Thanks to the pandemic, and before that even, there were many disruptions to supply chains and other parts of a very interconnected world economy. Geopolitical tensions have been rising between the US and China even before this conflict. So when you put all that together, again, at the margin, what is happening in Russia is raising geopolitical uncertainty, which certainly has a dampening effect on consumer and business confidence around the world. Financial markets have taken a hit. So even if the direct impact is limited yet again, there can be significant indirect impacts. But it's also worth thinking about what this might mean in terms of the longer term consequences for the world economic order. Now, it is interesting to note that while Russia's invasion of Ukraine has certainly brought the West closer together, there is a significant part of the rest of the world, especially as measured by population and also economic size, that seems to be taking a different stance. There is, of course, China, which seems to be aligning itself somewhat with Russia, even though it has not offered extensive material or financial support as yet. But there are many emerging market economies that have taken a much softer position than the Western world. So we might end up after this conflict with a cleavage in terms of the world, with the West having been brought much closer together in many dimensions, but much of the rest of the world evolving into a different camp. So I think in terms of multilateralism and in terms of both economic and geopolitical realignments, this conflict is going to have some long-term implications.
Thanks very much, Ishwar. Your comments leave us to think some, and questions that are being debated currently about whether the tragedy of this war will be kind of magnified by its impact on Ukraine as a major exporter of grain, and the impact on rising food prices for countries, particularly poor countries that import that grain. Do you want to speak to that point, to rising agricultural prices and their impact on the global economy briefly?
Yeah, this is going to hurt developing countries. My Dyson colleague, Chris Barrett, has been talking extensively about this issue. There are countries that are going to be vulnerable, not just to the increase in food prices, but also the fact that what is happening in Russia is going to create concerns about emerging market economies as an asset class, if one might get to talking about financial matters. In addition, given all the geopolitical and economic uncertainties that this conflict is setting off, it is certainly leading to a flight to safety, and safety in this world full of turmoil that we live in is still a flight of money into safe assets such as the US dollar. And as the US dollar appreciates, and as inflation in the US rises, and as the Fed may have to take more aggressive actions in terms of interest rate increases, this is going to have a very significant effect on the ability of developing countries and even middle-income emerging market economies to get financing in international markets. So both in terms of the availability of finance, in terms of the prices that they may have to pay for external finance, but also in terms of the impact of rising food and other commodity prices on developing countries, and particularly the economically underprivileged, the poor in developing countries, it's going to have a significant knock-on impact.
Thank you. So we'll turn now I'll invite some Cornell campus members to share their perspective. One of our students, Ivan Kasyuk, you're from Ukraine, an engineering student studying operations research and information engineering. And as I understand from day one of the war, you've been closely involved with the volunteer movement in Ukraine. Would you tell us about the extent to which people were prepared to aid Ukraine in humanitarian and infrastructure projects?
Hi, yes. From the day one, I was very closely involved with the tech sector in Ukraine. And one of the things that I was very interested in is how would businesses are in their nature very interlinked in Russian, Belarusian, and Ukrainian market react to this, very brutal act of war. And I was inspired and very surprised that a lot of big Ukrainian business in tech sector actually made a decision to completely cut off any connections to Belarusian and Russian offices. And not only that, but also use their clients, use their services as a basis for sharing information, sharing the truth, which of course puts them in danger of some kind of prosecution on the Russian end and hurt their business. But they followed what they believed is right. And I think this was one of the cornerstone events that right now leads to thousands of highly educated engineers in Ukraine, instead of trying to leave the country or just think about themselves, to actually join volunteer movements in sharing their information, somehow aiding Ukrainian government, somehow helping raise more and more donations through their understanding of blockchain, for example. And this is still going strong, and I think this is amazing, where it's not just actions and words, but it's actually people putting their money on the line for what they believe is right.
Yvonne, thanks so much. So I'll turn now to Olaf de Rohan-Wilner. Olaf, you're from London, you're French and British, an undergrad here at Cornell studying computer science and government. Would you tell us about the European response to the Russian invasion?
Yeah, of course. Thanks for having me. So what I've noticed is that most of Europe is in denial of the invasion. Nobody expected it, especially since EU-Russian relations had seemed to be going really well. My family was at an event at the Russian embassy in London just last November, and everything seemed to be going quite well. Most of my neighbors are Russian. They didn't expect anything to happen like it did. And yeah, as Europeans, we have a certain set of values that we follow, the rule of law, solidarity, and the conviction that diplomacy is always an option. Russia, by invading Ukraine, shattered those values, and today the war is really about where you stand on those values. And we've seen that's why there's been such big support for Ukraine, because they seem to support those values. The great leadership by Ursula von der Leyen reminded us of that European unity. But one thing is very clear is that European politics will be changed forever.
Thanks, Olaf. All right, finally, Olga Zimina, a Cornell postdoc in plant science, grew up in Crimea. I know you have a lot to share about experiences from your upbringing, as well as the impact of Russia's propaganda and recent actions. What would you like the rest of our Cornell campus community to know?
Yes, thank you for organizing this event and inviting me to speak. And yeah, I would like to share my experience and what I think is important to say. Yeah, I grew up in Crimea. I lived there and went to school, so I consider Crimea my homeland. Crimea, as well as the east region of Ukraine, are Russian-speaking regions, and Russian propaganda actually acted long before Crimea and Donbass was occupied. I remember, for example, like my teacher of history in our class, he didn't teach us facts, but misinterpreted the history, trying to justify the terror of Russian Empire as well as of Soviet Union against Ukrainian people. I also remembered how he hated Ukrainian literature and mentioned that it's weak and meaningless comparing to Russian literature. And yeah, like this, in this way, he created hate to everything Ukrainian. And I would say, in addition, Russian propaganda works successfully internationally in the world, creating a picture that Ukraine has an inner conflict between Ukrainian-speaking and Russian-speaking people. But in fact, from my experience, I have never experienced any pressure because I was speaking Russian, not in Crimea, not in Kiev, not in the west part of Ukraine. And I noticed also that successful Russian propaganda abroad, like many people all over the world saw that Ukraine was a part of Russia and considered us as the same country. And probably that's why, since Crimea and Donbass occupation, international community thought it's our inner conflict. And like Putin created this false picture about the genocide of Russian people in Ukraine. In fact, all Ukrainians, we lived peacefully together. We cheered for the same sport teams, listened to the same Ukrainian music, and we were raised in independent country with its own environment distinct from Russia. And if you can see right now, like Russian army bombed and shelled Russian-speaking regions. I mean, Putin doesn't care about Russian-speaking people at all. He just wants to force Ukraine to accept his terms. And right now it's a really hard situation, especially in Mariupol. They bombed civilian buildings, hospitals, maternal houses. Yesterday, they bombed a drum theater with a lot of people that were sheltered there. Yeah, they just created a huge humanitarian catastrophe. And I want to say also that the same approach and the same propaganda Russia implements in other countries. It occupied many territories of the neighboring countries like Chechnya, Moldova, Georgia. Russia participated in the war in Syria. It supported the dictatorship in Belarus. Russia brought their forces to suppress peaceful protest of Belarus people against falsified elections. Russia supported also dictatorship in Kazakhstan. And I want to say that Russia will not negotiate things by diplomacy. It understands only violence. And I hope the world will stop Russia right now. Otherwise, someone else will be next. And yeah, I hope the world will find the way how to do it. Thank you.
Thank you, Olga. And I think just the right note to end this portion of from our speakers on. I'd like to now open up for your questions. I will start in the spirit of the things that we can do concretely to help. There was a question to Yvonne in the chat from others on this campus about how they can support your activities. So Yvonne, can I turn it back over to you for a moment?
Yes. So currently, I help people in Ukraine, specifically the IT community, to connect as many international users as possible. And there are primarily two ways people outside of Ukraine can really help in this, I guess, informational battle with all the lies Russia is trying to share. And one, which will sound very simple and easy, but it's incredibly important, is to share as much information as you can, and not just some big posts about like, let's stop war, let's do this or let's do that, but just find personal stories of people who are right now in Ukraine, who goes through hardships, and make a post on Facebook, share it on Instagram, just send it to people who would listen to you, because I believe, and that's what community back home also believes in, is that connecting on the very basic human level is what allows to keep the support going. Because while, for example, people in Ukraine are very far away from the US, it can be very easy to just say, oh, well, it's just some people far away, they're having their own problems for some unknown reason. But when those people far away turn into like a mother who just lost a child to bombing, or just students who are trying to flee to some safer location, it becomes very hard to just forget about it. And as long as we can keep the stories going, that really helps. For more technically adept people, there are also ways to actually stop Russia from sharing their information. There are a lot of communities right now on the internet who come up with different algorithms to assault Russian propaganda websites, to make them not be able to operate, to make them not be able to continue sharing their news. And it goes to far extent to, for example, when you see this propaganda content, you report it. When you see videos on YouTube, you state in their comments, or once again in reports, that like it is not true information. But also something a little bit more violent, like just overloading their websites with simple algorithms. That's something that people outside of Ukraine can do, and that's something that's very helpful. So to sum it up, share personal stories because those stories matter. But if you want to stop Russia, you can use a lot of available algorithms online to overload their propaganda websites, videos, and everything. And this would help a lot.
Yvonne, thanks very much. So another question from the Q&A, and please, again, feel free to type your questions directly into our chat. We'll spend just probably 5 or 10 more minutes on questions. So I have a question from Amala Lane. Is there a possibility for the president and or Congress to implement temporary nationalization of fuel such that we can enforce lower prices? Is there any way that we could ban the purchase of any fossil fuel from Russia? And so maybe we could speak to the policy context for that, and also the economic consequences of such actions.
Do you want
Steve,
me
would you
to-
like to
Sure,
respond?
let me respond from again, a political perspective. Congress does not like to go too far too fast. It's a very incremental institution. And what I'm hearing is that the first and most likely response will be a temporary suspension of gas taxes. There will be some pushback on that, by the way, from the environmental community. But I believe that you will see a significant amount of focus on that as a first line. And if that is not effective, then Congress may take a look at other mechanisms. I don't see Congress going that far, quite that fast.
So on the economic impact, the US is now a net energy exporter. It's been for the last 3 or 4 years. And in fact, disruptions in procurement of Russian natural gas in particular would hurt European economies a lot more than the US. So certainly the fact that Europe, especially Germany, has been willing to step up and accept some of this pain is certainly a positive element, although they haven't completely blocked Russian natural gas exports to Europe. But the reality that we face is that, when you have disruptions of this sort, even if you don't directly buy Russian oil, it is going to have an effect on global oil prices. And that certainly is going to feed into domestic inflation at a time when inflation is already high. So there is a domestic political dimension to this as well, which Steve Israel sort of alluded to as the midterms loom. But certainly one should think about this in terms of the longer term, about whether our dependence on fossil fuels in particular is something we should be weaning ourselves from. But whether this event will cause that sort of change in the thinking of policymakers remains to be seen. I hope it does. I'm not too optimistic.
Thanks, Ishwar and Steve. So let me pick up on something that a discussion that's been going on in the chat that has to do with, we're a campus community. We have different programs, and I wanted to give Natalia a chance to speak to the role that Ukrainian studies and Ukrainian language programs could play within U.S. institutions, and what are the benefits of having those kinds of programs on campus might be.
Yes, thank you for this question. I noticed it in the chat and I tried to type something in already. Well, I think that Russia has been dominating the scene of post-Soviet studies for all the time so far. And it means that Russia's voice has been the loudest voice, and it might be seen as the most important and as the most confident, as giving you the most kind of information you would want to trust. But I think establishing a Ukrainian studies program, and not only a Ukrainian studies program, but also maybe a Kazakh studies program, a Belarus studies program, would be a way to give an opportunity for these other states, for these other voices to be heard. And for your own Western expertise, it could also be beneficial, because you could then have an opportunity, have a chance to listen to different opportunities, yes, to different voices, to different opinions on one and the same issue, and maybe a chance to compare. Because you should really, in this world of many different ideas, you should be not only critical, but you should not forget that there are also other post-Soviet republics, yes? And many of them have tried to take a route quite different in their development, to take a route quite different from the route that Russia has been taken. Russia is very archaic. Russia is still cherishing its Soviet past. Ukraine has taken quite a different route. From my research, speaking from my research, I've done research on decommunization processes, and specifically on decommunization renaming in southeastern Ukraine. And from interviewing these people who took an active part, these were grassroots initiatives. They took an active part in suggesting these decommunization renamings, new place names. I saw, most of them were Russian speaking, by the way. I saw how much they wanted to get rid of the Soviet past, of these Soviet place names, of these Soviet monuments. And this is quite different. This is one thing that is very different that developed in Ukraine, but did not develop in Russia. So just to give you an example, it might be a good establishing a Ukrainian studies program might be a good chance to give an opportunity for another voice to be heard, for another perspective to be seen, to be listened to. Thank you.
Thanks, Natalia. Yulia, did you want to add?
Yeah, I just want to add that I totally agree with Natalia, because I have my own experience when I'm communicated with the colleagues from, let's say, United States or Europe, and mostly they were colleagues from Russia and Eurasian studies. And let's say that scientific and research traditions rooted in Soviet studies, at least in United States, and mostly this they were people who could fluently speak or read Russian only, and actually this I would say tradition in American academia, in European academia, also led to some misunderstanding of the stories of regime changes in Ukraine. And actually this usage of Russian language as the main source of information also led to the situation that Russian propaganda also spread in Western academia as well, because people were just limited by their lingual skills, let's say, even some American professors. And the last which I want to say from my own experience, for example, recently I refused to take part in a conference which I applied like 3 months ago, and which was appointed on June, because representatives of Russian academia still were in the program, and I can imagine me taking part in this event together with Russian colleagues and being treated in a similar way, because it's still like painful for me personally. So maybe you should do not do these mistakes like a lot of Germans do when they try to bring Russians and Ukrainians at the same table and make them talk to each other like equal persons or equal representatives, because I think that it's not the decision for, let's say, next few years. It would be very uncomfortable for Ukrainian scholars, definitely.
Thanks, Yulia. All right, so a question in the chat from Evelyn Ferretti that I may use my prerogative as chair and moderator here to give some thoughts on. The question is, whether Putin has been seriously mistaken. The question is, if Putin has been seriously mistaken about deep Ukrainian versus Russian divisions within Ukraine, might he also be seriously mistaken about a pro versus anti-war division within Russia itself? And the question is, how solid is general Russian support of the war in Ukraine really? Right? So Russia, which has had a very strong public opinion and survey tradition for many, many years, right, is now, of course, in crisis. We can't refer to this as a war under Russian legislation, but social surveys go on, and those that are published that have fall into two camps, by independent researchers and by organs that are directly connected with the state. So support for the war, according to these surveys, for what they're worth, stands at about between 60 and 70%, but with significant minorities saying that they are opposed. And this is saying that they are opposed to state polling organs in the context of a wartime. So we're talking, 20, 25% of people who say they're opposed. And so when we think about sort of the mobilizational potential around an anti-war movement in Russia, there is a significant minority that does not agree with Putin's war. It is also the case that there's been very significant outmigration from Russia amongst those groups that are most likely to oppose this war. who may continue to oppose it from abroad, but that outmigration may also provide something of perhaps a safety valve for Putin in terms of the buildup of domestic anti-war sentiment. But some very courageous anti-war protests just this week. Some of you may have followed on Russia's most prominent sort of propaganda nightly newscasts on Channel 1. There was a protest, an anti-war protest by a woman with a Ukrainian father and Russian mother, or perhaps it was the other way around. But describing the shame that Russians will feel for generations about this fratricidal, about initiating this fratricidal war. So that's a few thoughts on your question, Evelyn. Let me close one last question here with regards to NATO, and perhaps Matt Evangelista, you'd like to take this. Gustavo Flores Macias is asking whether someone could speak to Ukraine's request to join NATO and NATO's apparent reluctance to date. Ukraine seems to think that NATO has turned its back on its request. Is that a fair characterization?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Gustavo. I think it is a fair characterization. Even when NATO was proposing the so-called open door to countries like Georgia and Ukraine, former republics of the Soviet Union, it was still premised on the condition that they not be involved in any ongoing territorial disputes, because NATO is committed to defend its members. And if a country is already under threat, NATO would not be interested in having them as members. And so it's not surprising that Russia got involved in a war with Georgia in 2008, and then in Ukraine in 2014, as if to make the point that, okay, these countries don't qualify anymore. So that's one issue. The other issue is whether NATO is in some respects already overextended. We almost saw NATO destroyed thanks to Donald Trump. It seems more solid than ever, with neutral countries like Sweden and Finland thinking of joining. But we have to remember what it is about NATO that provides defense of these countries. If some countries are on the border of Russia and Russia provokes some kind of an action that would lead to a conflict, it would be extremely dangerous. I worry in particular about countries like Estonia, whose city of Narva is literally across the Narva River from Russia, and whose population is 90% Russian. If Putin wanted to create an incident in Narva, where by all accounts the Russians are happy to be Estonian citizens, nevertheless, if he provoked an incident, what would NATO's strategy for defending Narva be? The Russian troops could just literally wade across the river and take the city, and NATO's response would be essentially, if you do that, we blow up the world. Okay, that was the strategy for defending West Berlin, deep in East German territory, surrounded by thousands, tens of thousands of Soviet troops. That was NATO's nuclear deterrent strategy, and people, I think, should be worried about it. And I think that's one of the sources of caution and reluctance to extend NATO membership to Ukraine.
Thanks very much, Matt. So I think we're moving now just a few minutes late into breakout rooms. And so for those of you that can hang tight for some smaller group discussions, we will see you there.